I'm Carl Nassman in Washington, and this is BBC World News America. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer says the UK will recognize a Palestinian state later this year unless Israel agrees to a ceasefire in Gaza. We have our correspondent standing by in Westminster and at the United Nations with all the political and diplomatic reaction. Also in the program, Russia continues its bombardment in Ukraine, targeting more than 70 cities and killing more than 30 people. And a vigil is planned in New York City a day after a man stormed a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, killing 4 people before shooting himself. Welcome to this extended hour of World News America. UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer says the country will recognize a Palestinian state in September. That's unless the Israeli government takes steps to end what he called the appalling situation in Gaza. Israel's Prime Minister condemned the move, saying, quote, Starmer rewards Hamas's monstrous terrorism and punishes its victims. A jihadist state on Israel's border today will threaten Britain tomorrow. Here now is the moment that Sir Keir Starmer made that decision.
I can confirm the UK will recognise the State of Palestine by the United Nations General Assembly in September unless the Israeli government takes substantive steps to end the appalling situation in Gaza, agree to a ceasefire and commit to a long-term sustainable peace, reviving the prospect of a two-state solution. And this includes allowing the UN to restart the supply of aid and making clear that there will be no annexations in the West Bank.
Yeah, that move comes shortly after France became the first G7 nation to announce it will recognize a Palestinian state. France welcomed Sir Keir Starmer's policy change on Tuesday, saying that the combined efforts will help put an end to the, quote, endless cycle of violence. All of this amid increasing international pressure over the scenes of mass starvation in Gaza. A UN-backed review on Tuesday warned that the worst-case scenario of famine is currently unfolding in Gaza, with widespread starvation, malnutrition, and disease, increasing hunger-related deaths. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says that Palestinians in Gaza are enduring a humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions. He made the remarks on the second day of a UN conference on a two-state solution in the Middle East. That's despite boycotts from the U.S. and from Israel. Well, join me live now are our political correspondent, Damian Grammaticus. He's in London for us. Our State Department correspondent, Tom Bakeman, is at the United Nations. Damian, let's just start with you. Walk us through this decision and what led to this announcement from the Prime Minister today.
Well, I think 2 things have led to it. One is increasing public sort of disquiet, I think, and Sir Keir Starmer himself described that, he said, as disgust at the scenes people are seeing on their TV screens of what's happening in Gaza, but also political pressure on him from within his own party. So just in the last few days, half of his backbench MPs, that's members of parliament from the Labour Party who are not in government jobs, half of them have signed a letter calling for the immediate recognition of Palestine. And within his own cabinet, his most senior ministers, some have also been urging him. So today he called this cabinet meeting. He'd spoken to President Trump yesterday, and then today they sat down and agreed, signed off on this idea. And so Keir Starmer came out and said it was, he said, because the idea of a two-state solution, he said, was now under threat. This is the moment to act. So that's why he's attached those conditions. That's why he says this is going to be part of a process designed to try to kickstart a peace process in the Middle East.
Yeah, Damien, on those conditions, what exactly is the UK kind of demanding here, and how likely is it that Israel will agree to those?
Well, Israel has already said it's not agreeing, as you were saying. Prime Minister Netanyahu has already rejected this. The conditions Keir Starmer had set were several: an immediate ceasefire, allowing the UN to resume aid deliveries, making clear that there would be no annexation of territory in the West Bank by Israel, and committing to a peace process that would lead to a two-state solution. Now, those things Benjamin Netanyahu has been unable to agree to. That means that the UK had said it would wait until September, but already seems clear. Keir Starmer said if the conditions weren't met, he would recognise Palestine. That's what we're moving towards.
Damien Grammaticus there for us in London, and Tom Bateman standing by for us at the United Nations. And Tom, we heard the announcement today, what seems like a big shift on policy for the UK. How far apart now are the UK and the US when it comes to the way they see a two-state solution in the region?
Well, they're extremely split over this, as is the US from the rest of its European allies, frankly. The reason this has happened, Carl, is because of the position of the Trump administration. If you think back to last year, the Biden administration was always trying to sort of fit in this position between the two elements of this, where it was both trying to support its ally Israel with continuing overwhelming military aid and support, but on the other hand was extremely aware of the pressures both domestically within the US from Democrats and basically from the rest of the world about trying to keep alive a post-war scenario for Gaza's governance that didn't involve it descending into utter chaos, which we are now in fact seeing, and also to keep alive the hopes of a longer-term solution to the decades-old conflict, and that would always have taken the form of the so-called two-state solution. Now, with the Biden administration, they had their European allies on board, and in effect they could control the situation. They could say to Europeans, look, don't do a kind of unilateral recognition of a state of Palestine now, because we're going to try and get the whole package going. The US was behind that. The Trump administration is in a totally different place. Their position on this has been without a strategic future other than to back whatever the Israeli government wants to do. And then we've heard the Trump administration flip between these ideas like building the Mediterranean, the Riviera of the Middle East in Gaza, expelling its population, things that Donald Trump even today seemed to completely back away from, and things that would break international law. So there isn't a viable strategic position by the US. And I think now the Europeans are saying we're going to go ahead without you, both because of the moral imperative, because there is now starvation in Gaza, and also because of the politics of this. They think this is the only way to try and somehow coax the US back to a workable diplomatic rather than military outcome to this conflict.
Tom Bateman, our State Department correspondent, thank you so much for your reporting, as well as Damien Grammaticus joining us tonight from London. Thank you to you both. On the ground in Gaza, health authorities say 147 people, including 88 children, have died of malnutrition since the war began. Israel insists that there are no restrictions on aid deliveries and that there is no starvation, and has allowed airdrops of aid to resume in the territory. But top humanitarian groups warn that that will not be enough to curb the mounting crisis. It can even be dangerous in and of themselves. As Gazans await life-saving aid, airstrikes continued Tuesday. The Hamas-run health ministry says at least 112 people were killed in just the past day. The ministry and local hospitals say at least 14 people were killed, 100 more injured at an aid distribution site. The Israeli government does not allow the BBC and other news organizations into Gaza. Our Middle East correspondent Hugo Bachega filed this report from Jerusalem, and a warning: it does contain disturbing images from the start. We can speak to Trevor Keck now. He's the Deputy Head of Policy and Humanitarian Affairs Advisor with the Washington delegation of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Great to have you on the BBC. Really, that dire report from UN-backed experts saying that the worst case scenario of famine currently playing out. Can you put that report into perspective for us? What did you make of that?
Thanks for having me, Carl. What I can speak to is what our teams are telling me from the ground, which is that there's severe malnutrition, and some of the same anecdotes that you shared from one of your correspondents about, people struggling to find food, mothers that are trying to breastfeed their children can't unfortunately make enough milk, people trying to get food off the market as well, and the price for basic goods that you and I might buy here in the United States or in the UK, something like $3 to $4 for a bag of flour or some sugar costs $50 to $80 in Gaza. because of this crisis of a lack of supply and as well as a liquidity crisis in Gaza. So what's really needed, Carl, is a surge in aid, a surge in as we're starting to see. We're not starting to see a surge yet. We're starting to see some increased flows of assistance following the announcements of this weekend. What we really need, though, is a massive surge of assistance to meet this fairly catastrophic situation on the ground.
Yeah, Trevor, I think that's the next question, really, because, Israel said it would start to ease some of its restrictions, that it would do these airdrops, humanitarian corridors to begin to allow more aid in. Is that enough? If it follows through on all of those steps, is that enough to begin to alleviate this hunger crisis?
It really depends on what happens on the ground. The tactical pauses, airdrops, these are very limited steps in the right direction, but is not going to be enough to respond to catastrophic needs on the ground. What you were showing from your correspondence. So a massive surge in assistance, like we've seen in previous ceasefires. Security for humanitarian organizations to operate. That it's incredibly dangerous in Gaza. We need people with guns, and that includes any IDF, Hamas, other actors, to ensure humanitarian organizations can move around Gaza without being shot at. We've lost 6 people ourselves, and that's a relatively small number actually compared to other humanitarian organizations. So that needs to be addressed, and then a ceasefire ultimately. The only time we've seen serious relief for the civilian population in Gaza and solutions for the hostages has been during a ceasefire, meaning hostages are able to get out and get home to return to their families. During the 2 ceasefires we've seen, that's the only time we've seen that kind of relief for everyone.
Trevor, just before I let you go here, about 30 seconds left, but it's a crisis not just about food. We've also heard of a lack of fuel, a lack of water. What else is needed in the territory?
Medical items, safe and clean water, cooking fuel. I spoke to my colleagues today who were telling me that people are resorting to burning plastic because they can't access cooking oil or firewood to cook the meals, the limited meals they might get. So there's a tremendous need for a range of humanitarian supplies. It's good they're prioritizing food right now because of what we're seeing on the ground. We've been waiting for weeks to get some of our medical items in for our 60-bed field hospital in Gaza.
Okay. It's many items still needed there, clearly. Trevor Keck with the ICRC, we always appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl.
Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. You're live with BBC News. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia has ignored President Trump's latest peace ultimatum and pressed on with its bombing campaign. Local officials say Moscow targeted more than 70 Ukrainian towns and villages Tuesday in the latest attacks, killing at least 25 people. The strikes came just hours after President Trump set a new deadline of 10 to 12 days for Russia to end its invasion of Ukraine or face new sanctions. The Kremlin said Tuesday that President Putin remains committed to a peace settlement. Our defense correspondent Jonathan Beale reports now from Kyiv. Jonathan Beale reporting there from Kyiv, and we can bring in now Ambassador Kay Bailey Hutchison, U.S. permanent representative to NATO from 2017 until 2021 under President Trump's first administration. Always great to see you. What about this new deadline? I believe actually we heard on Air Force One a few hours ago that it's now 10 days. The president has kind of coalesced onto that. What kind of effect do you think this have? What do you think the effect could be of this shorter timeline? Will that increase pressure on Vladimir Putin?
I hope so. I hope now that the president has clearly seen Vladimir Putin for what he is, and setting a deadline, I think, is very important. And I think at this point, we have already agreed to sell more weapons to Europe, which is going to provide them to the Ukrainians to be able to maybe take out some of those bases where the drones are coming in and killing their people and destroying their infrastructure.
Well, Ambassador, how likely is it that Russia actually will back down at this point? Every report we're getting from the front line shows Russia gaining territory. Do you think that this new pressure, even threatened sanctions, will really resonate in the Kremlin?
I think these secondary sanctions are much more detrimental to the economy of Russia. I think that Russia is going to suffer. It's an economy that is already pretty low. And I think that is what will get Vladimir Putin's attention when nothing else seems to.
What about Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky? Do you think Ukrainians might be beginning to lose a bit of patience, maybe with him as well as this war effort itself? We saw recently some of the first protests. These were anti-corruption demonstrations since Russia's full-scale invasion.
I think the Ukrainian people have seen really the president standing strong for 3 years now. I don't think that his popularity is waning. Of course, people are they're tired, they are beleaguered, they've lost loved ones. It's a terrible situation for anyone to deal with. But I think President Zelensky is the right person to do it. He has stood strong, even in the early days when no one thought they had a chance. They've stuck it out. The Ukrainian people are going to be the heroes of this century for what they have endured and never given up. And I think in the end, they will have their country, their sovereign nation. It may have a few things they didn't like in it, but I think now that the arms are going to be more available for the Ukrainians, Russia will see that this will not end quickly, and that if secondary sanctions go in against a country like India that is subsidizing the effort to do these things to Ukraine, then I think maybe we will see a turning point.
Ambassador Kate Bailey Hutchison, always great to get your thoughts. The former U.S. permanent representative to NATO under President Trump's first administration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl.
We're learning more about Monday's deadly shooting in a Manhattan office building. 4 people, including a New York City police officer working as a security guard, were killed when this man opened fire in a building where the National Football League has its headquarters. Officials say the 27-year-old gunman who played football as a teenager was carrying a note that appeared to blame the NFL for a brain injury. He eventually turned the gun on himself. There will be a vigil for the victims of that shooting later on this evening in New York City. And joining us now live from New York is CBS News correspondent Jared Hill. Jared, what more do we know? Obviously, we're still working through some of these details, but in terms of the suspect itself, what more can you tell us? Welcome back to World News America. International pressure is growing on Israel. Sir Keir Starmer says the UK will formally recognize the state of Palestine in September, following France. That's unless Israel allows humanitarian aid into Gaza and commits to a ceasefire. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu accused Mr. Starmer of rewarding what he called, quote, Hamas's monstrous terrorism. Israel has allowed airdrops of aid to resume, but top humanitarian groups warn that that won't be enough to curb the mounting crisis as the conflict in Gaza continues to rage on. Let's get more on today's announcement from the UK. Joining me live is John Alterman. He's the Bigny of Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Seemingly a big shift in policy today from the UK. Do you think that we are seeing some sort of turning point in terms of international sentiment towards the region and towards this conflict?
To my mind, the degree of hunger that's really visible to everybody on images coming out of Gaza has created an inflection point. What I see the British Prime Minister doing is trying to give himself some space, both in terms of British politics and in terms of Middle East diplomacy, to be in play as this unfolds. I don't think we're at the point of a diplomatic breakthrough on Arab-Israeli peacemaking, the future of a Palestinian state. But I think what we saw Keir Starmer do is to say, when that moment comes, Britain intends to be a player and not a bystander.
I think it's worth mentioning already more than 140 countries or so do recognize Palestine as a state. I mean, do you think that this will have any sort of impact on a ceasefire, on the humanitarian situation?
I really don't. I think that the challenge of acknowledging or recognizing statehood for people who clearly don't have sovereignty. They can't control what happens. They can't even draw the purported borders of the state. That's not really a state. You can call it what you want. It seems to me the role of the UN should be to recognize states and to work toward the recognition of states. But I'm not sure that the recognition itself is really changes the equation. The other challenge here is that Israel is a democracy, and an overwhelming percentage of the Israeli public believes that a Palestinian state would threaten the security of Israel. I think an important part of the international effort is partly creating the circumstances for a state, but also reassuring Israelis that rather than threatening them, this will make them more secure.
Yeah, well, we heard the justification and the pushback from the prime minister calling this a reward for Hamas. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that's where he's coming from. It's where his political base is. Because that's what he says doesn't mean the rest of the world has to accept it, or that he is necessarily a perfect vessel for conveying what the Israeli public either believes or will believe. 75% of Israelis polled, as I understand it, think that they should work out a deal to return the hostages and end the war. That's not where the prime minister is. But now that the Knesset is out of session for about 10 weeks, and they can't bring down the government, I think the entire world sees an opportunity for some diplomacy where Netanyahu won't have to look over his shoulder at all the politics.
Yeah, and that was my last question here, about a minute left. But, what does this mean for Prime Minister Netanyahu and his far-right political cabinet, within which there are at least a couple of different members who, are not only against a two-state solution, but are almost pushing for further annexation of territory?
Right, and they're talking about putting Jewish settlers back into Gaza and never giving up Gaza again. I mean, that it represents a minority of both his cabinet and a minority of the Israeli political viewpoint. Netanyahu's challenge, and this is a challenge every Israeli prime minister has, is how do you have enough coherence in the government to do things you want to do? The Israeli system gives August, September, and often part of October, the Knesset's out of session, and that's a time when Israeli prime ministers have negotiated in the absence of political pressures to see what they can deliver. But I don't think he thinks he has to get this done at the beginning of that period. I think he's probably going to wait a month or so and see what he can get from others in the process.
John B. Alterman, the Zbigniew Brzezinski Chair in Global Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl.
Here in the U.S., some Republican politicians are becoming a bit more publicly critical about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza following more direct comments by the Trump administration acknowledging that starvation does exist in the territory. When asked for a reaction on Tuesday to the British Prime Minister's statement on a Palestinian state, the White House said that the president did not mind Sir Keir taking a position and is, quote, looking for getting people fed right now. Never a quiet day here in Washington. To help us break down, we have a political panel with me in studio. To my far left there, Jay Chabria, Republican strategist and former advisor to Vice President J.D. Vance, and Yemisi Egbawole, Democratic strategist, former chief of staff to President Joe Biden's White House press office. Great to have you both here. I just want to start on that point of Republicans, because on Monday, and Jay, obviously, as a former Vance advisor, we heard the vice president speaking in Ohio to a rally there. And it was interesting to hear what he had to say specifically about the situation in Gaza. Let's take a listen. Let's return now to that climate story right now. A bit more detail on that. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency moving to revoke what is a long-standing finding in the country that greenhouse gas emissions endanger public health. It's a proposal that climate advocates warn could become the most significant deregulation in U.S. history. It would roll back the so-called endangerment finding of 2009. It provided the legal basis for U.S. climate policy and emissions regulations under the Clean Air Act. The current EPA head said that they're, quote, proposing to end 16 years of uncertainty for automakers and American consumers. More than 30 environmental rules on issues like clean air, clean water, and climate change would be affected. It's being criticized by some lawmakers and health experts, including a recent EPA administrator. Gina McCarthy told the BBC that Trump's EPA is, quote, trying every trick in the book to deny and avoid their mission to protect people and the environment from the ravages of unchecked climate pollution. Instead of doing their job, this EPA is putting the safety of our loved ones at risk while ratcheting up grid instability, energy bills, and disaster costs. Meanwhile, Brazil has passed a new law to simplify and reduce the environmental licensing process for new infrastructure there. A veto from Brazil's president could still come. Currently, the country requires an environmental license to ensure development projects won't cause unacceptable environmental harm. The United Nations has criticized the legislation, saying that it would represent a rollback for decades of protections in Brazil. And of course, it all comes ahead of the UN's COP30 climate summit. Brazil will be hosting that in the Amazon in November. Our correspondent Ione Wells has been speaking to UN experts. She joins me now from Sao Paulo. And Ione, what more can you tell us about this new law there in Brazil? England's Lionesses celebrated their Euros football victory in London on Tuesday with a parade that saw thousands of fans lining the Mall for the homecoming celebration. Serena Wiegmann's players gathered around the stage outside of Buckingham Palace, where there was an outpouring of pride for those Lionesses. 65,000 fans there. Our sports correspondent Natalie Perks has this report now from the Palace. If they're not done yet, maybe a three-peat in the works. Remember, you can always find the day's top stories on our website. That's bbc.com/news. And of course, you can see what we're working on at any time. Just check out your favorite social media site. I'm Carl Nassman. Thanks for watching World News America.